Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
On a very windy day here in Bloomington. I hope everyone's safe and sound. Today we take up Gate 48 of the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination, and our gate statement for today says, "Hidden expedient means are a gate of Dharma illumination, for they are sensitive to many kinds of suffering." The kanji for this gate refer to the expedient means. When it's talking about hidden expedient means, what the kanjis are actually saying are about the four great elements coming together to become the five skandhas of body and mind. So when we get clear about that, according to this statement, when we get clear about the expedient means of the five skandhas, then we're prepared to be aware of the entirety of suffering. So when this says, sensitive to many kinds of suffering, we're then prepared to be aware of all of the permutations of suffering that there are. So that's the context for today's conversation. So again, five skandhas are the components that come together to make up the individual, right? To make up the individual being. So quick review, the four elements, we've talked about these before, are earth, air, fire, and water. These come together to make up the body, which is the first of the five skandhas. This is the physical form of the five skandhas. After the body, then those other four skandhas are functions of mind. Those are mental elements. So again, now we have body as the first, or form as the first of the skandhas. We have feeling, which is getting that sense information from the body. We have perception, which is creating the mental images or the concepts out of that sensory information that we're receiving. Formation is about the will that makes us want to take action based on images and ideas. This is our motivation for doing something, right? And finally, consciousness is what's doing the discernment. It's what's doing the integration of the feeling and perception and the will to take some action, right? So quick review, five skandhas. So the coming together of the five skandhas results in this idea, this feeling or whatever, that there is a fixed and permanent self. When those five skandhas come together, out of that somehow we create the story that there is some kind of unchanging self, some kind of fixed self nature. It's an illusion. We know from Buddha's teachings and somewhat from our own experience that this story is an illusion, but still, somehow immediately there is clinging. Immediately, as soon as five skandhas come together, there was clinging to this idea about personhood, or that there's some fixed and unchanging self. So first we cling to the body. We decide this body is me somehow. This is what self is. Then we take the feelings that come from that body, the sense organs, and we layer that on top of the clinging to body. Then we decide we have to take some action in order to gratify this body and the senses, and there's our motivation for acting. That's about getting stuff we want, running away from stuff we don't want. This is where we get swept away by the three poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance. This is also where we create karma with body, speech, and mind. So consciousness then pulls all this together and creates this very complex, subtle picture of this thing that we call self. So all of these elements come together, interact together, and out of this arises this very complicated sort of formation of self. So in the Buddhist tradition, there are four layers of consciousness. Hojo-san has talked about these a number of times, but again, quick review. On the surface, there is mind consciousness. This is our day-to-day, moment-by-moment thinking, worrying, planning, right? This is this is what we do on a moment-by-moment basis. The next level down is the sense consciousness. This is physical senses coming into contact with a sense object. And we have some experience of what that contact is like. So we taste something, we see something, we hear something. We have some experience about what that contact is like when our physical senses are in touch with something. The next layer is the storehouse consciousness, or the alaya consciousness. This is what stores and processes all kinds of information, all kinds of seeds, all kinds of experiences for us. This alaya consciousness is changing all the time. It is not a fixed and permanent anything, partly because it's always taking in new information. We're always having new experiences, new thoughts, new ideas. It's constantly taking in all this information. It's also transforming it and processing it and doing something with it. So this alaya consciousness is not something we can grasp and say, this is a fixed, permanent something. This is changing all the time too. So, we see something, we taste something, we have some experience of something. It gets added into this storehouse consciousness, and it gets processed and transformed and worked with. So storehouse consciousness operates at a deeper level than mind consciousness, our sort of moment by moment thinking. So it can actually drive actions by itself without the help of the mind consciousness, right? So, you get cold in the night and you pull up the blanket without really totally waking up, or having some conscious decision to pull up the blanket. You're in the store, you need to choose between the birthday card that has the puppy with the glasses and the birthday hat, or, the sailboat scene, the more serene kind of sailboat scene. It's like you're drawn to one or the other, right? Some kind of decisions are getting made. You're walking along, minding your own business, something falls over in front of you, you jump out of the way. You're not consciously going through a process that says, oh, something fell over, or there's a hole there, I need to jump out of the way. There's a response there, right? So, storehouse consciousness is really impressionable, because this is where we take in all of these things. So it's not that mind consciousness is deciding what ought to get stored there. Storehouse consciousness is just taking it all in. So there's, mind, this upper level, or, more surface level mind consciousness is not running that show. It's not making a choice. So there's all kinds of impressions in there, including the stuff we pick up from other people, the stuff we pick up from our culture, our surroundings. Here is where Sawaki Roshi's group stupidity can start to take hold, right? Or getting these impressions from other people. So out of the awareness of mind consciousness, somehow decisions are getting made, right, at a deeper level. So it's the storehouse consciousness that decides that it's a separate self. It decides that there's a fixed and permanent self, which is separate from everything else that's around it. That's not the mind consciousness sort of making that choice. It's not the day-to-day thinking, worrying mind that's writing that story about self at its deepest level. Of course, in a moment by moment way, I'm deciding I'm hungry, I want chocolate cake. I'm aware that somehow that I'm making some choices, but the driver for that is deeper than that. So finally, under all of that manas consciousness, under all of that alaya consciousness is the manas consciousness. Its entire function is to cling to the storehouse consciousness as a separate self, right? So the ignorance and the fear that are present already in the storehouse consciousness give rise to this manas, and the manas turns around and clings to the storehouse as a fixed and permanent self and sort of never lets go. So the storehouse and the manas consciousness never really turn off, right? The mind consciousness might stop when we go to sleep or we fall into a coma or something. These other two are always functioning as long as we're alive. These are, just constant processes, constant elements underlying us. So the gate statement says that teachings about the 5 skandhas are an expedient means, and that when that's clear, then we're able to recognize many kinds of suffering. So something that moves ourselves and others toward awakening or toward living in a kind of awakened way is what we would call skillful means or expedient means. So the inference here is, that whatever this expedient means doesn't need to be literally true as long as it serves the purpose of moving ourselves and beings toward liberation. It might be, true on a certain level. It doesn't have to be 100% true in the absolute sense. If it's useful in moving beings toward awakening, it's okay to use it. So we see various instances in the Pali Canon and in the Lotus Sutra of the Buddha giving different teachings to different people depending on the times, depending on their circumstances, what they're able and ready to take in. When we're in the grip of the manas consciousness, clinging to the alaya consciousness, clinging to some idea of self, then we need to hear some teachings about the 5 skandhas and how that whole thing works. So it's the only way we're going to understand that our suffering comes from wanting things to be different than they are, right? The illusory self wants things to be different for that illusory self. Somehow I want more things, or I want fewer things I don't like, right? So until we encountered Buddha's teaching, probably we, didn't understand how suffering is created and suffering is perpetuated by ourselves and for ourselves and by and for other beings around us. So, we're not born with understanding of the Four Noble Truths. Even Shakyamuni wasn't born with that. He had to sit under the tree, and sort of wake up to the Four Noble Truths. So we're not born understanding necessarily the nature of suffering and the five skandhas and the four layer of consciousness and all those things. So we just think there's a me that needs things. We have no reason not to think that. It's a completely reasonable construction. We have no reason not to think that there's a separate me. It would be, it's easy to write that story and then cling to that story. So, then one day maybe we meet the Buddha somehow. We start to see how the parts come together and how there's some energy that holds those parts together. Then we see that there's a way to maybe break the grip of our delusion and our suffering. And yay, we have bodhicitta, right? We've aroused bodhi mind. We've aroused some desire to practice and to see clearly. So, okay, now we're bodhisattvas. We're practicing in the world. We encounter the Heart Sutra, which we're about to chant at the end of this lecture for our world peace ceremony today, right? Somehow we're bodhisattvas. We're moving through the world. We encounter the Heart Sutra. Heart Sutra says there are no five skandhas. And we're going, wait a minute. Oh, I get it. Five skandhas are expedient means, right? The point of the teachings about the five skandhas is to show us that there's no fixed and permanent self. Oh, okay. Well, but at the same time that we kind of get that, we're asking ourselves, well, now wait a minute. Why would Buddha teach that there are five skandhas if this sutra comes around and says, well, there aren't any five skandhas? What's going on? What's he doing? So the Lotus Sutra explains about expedient means in several places. This comes up in a couple of different places in the Lotus Sutra. In the second chapter, Buddha explains that the whole reason that Buddhas appear in the world is to help move everybody toward the same kind of awakening that they have. Buddhas are there to help us live from the same place, that Buddhas live. But not everybody has the capacity to take in those teachings at their highest level, to understand and make use of those teachings. So these Buddhas devise skillful means, expedient means, to sort of lead us on, to help us understand, but also to encourage us to practice, right? To encourage us not to give up on practice. So later on in the 25th chapter, the Universal Gateway chapter, as that chapter is known, Buddha explains that Avalokiteshvara takes any bodily form that's necessary under particular circumstances in order to save beings, right? So he can appear in a number of different forms. He might be a layperson, he might be an elder, he might be a minister of state, he might be somebody's wife, he might be a young boy or a young girl. Whatever physical form is necessary in that moment to move beings toward awakening is what he's going to do. So in the standard Sotoshu morning service, we actually chant that chapter. It's called the Fumon Bonge. We chant it every day. It's that important in our tradition, right? We actually chant that chapter every day. So for Avalokiteshvara, the five skandhas can take on any number of forms as an expedient means to allow him to see all kinds of suffering, as the skate statement says, and to actually be helpful and to be useful with all those kinds of suffering beings. So the skandhas don't make up a fixed self. They and the teachings about them are in their way an expedient means. So we can use the teachings about the five skandhas to start letting go of our clinging to self and our clinging to ego and our, writing our stories about the fixed permanent nature of self. At some point then, we can also let go of clinging to the teachings about the five skandhas. Ultimately, we see that those teachings are empty. The five skandhas are empty and the teachings are empty. And then we can even sort of move past needing to cling to those teachings about five skandhas as expedient means. So there's an analogy that says that the average person's view is like a sky which is obstructed by clouds. The Bodhisattva's view doesn't have the clouds, it just has a little bit of haze. The Buddha's view is completely clear, and the Buddha can see instances of haze that even the Bodhisattva can't see, right? So we have these increasing levels of clarity. The Heart Sutra says that the Bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, aroused his original wisdom and saw that all five skandhas are empty, and in that moment was released from suffering. So in that sutra, it says he's released from all suffering and distress. So it's not, part of it. He's released from all of it. So even as this gate statement says, we can see the entirety of suffering. We can be sensitive to all the myriad kinds of suffering. So this is a big thing. So Buddha's method is that expedient means exist only for people who need them, for as long as they need them. And when that need is gone, then those expedient means they should disappear. They say it's like imaginary jewels, right? So these are things that have value, like jewels do, but somehow they become imaginary. Maybe, as this gate statement says, they become hidden expedient means somehow. So the five skandhas being free from clinging to five skandhas on the basis of emptiness is the equivalent of Dogen Zenji's Shinjin Datsuraku, dropping off body and mind. It's the equivalent of Sawaki Roshi's Zazen is good for nothing. It's the equivalent of Uchiyama Roshi's opening the hand of thought. It's the same as Hojo-san's 1 = 0 = infinity, right? So all of these are ways of kind of pointing toward the same teaching. So getting clear on this puts us in the same position as Avalokiteshvara in this sutra. Now we are bodhisattvas. We're able to help other beings move toward liberation or move toward awakening. So Avalokiteshvara in the sutra goes on to explain his understanding to Shariputra. And what is that but expedient means, right? Until Shariputra can understand this for himself, based on his own insight and his own experience. And at that point, he too can let go of these teachings about the five skandhas. But in the meantime, Avalokiteshvara has to explain this to him, right? So we see this over and over and over, how these teachings are important, but they're expedient means, and at some point even we let go of those teachings. So prajna, wisdom, is understanding the expedient means and also understanding the emptiness, right? So we need to carry both. So on that basis, compassion for others arises. This is the basis of the Bodhisattva, right? We need this human form made up of the five skandhas in order to carry out that compassion, right? In order to manifest that compassion. So somehow we can't quite let go of five skandhas as bodhisattvas. We have to see the expedient means and carry that, and we also have to see the emptiness so we don't get stuck somewhere. So sometimes this is called the twofold expediency of the bodhisattva. So the bodhisattva doesn't fall into attachment because of the wisdom. Bodhisattva sees the emptiness of people and things and doesn't fall into clinging and attachment because of that. But he also doesn't abandon people, right? Somehow still he's interested in helping. Somehow still the compassion is there. He doesn't lose sight of impermanence or interconnectedness or the illusory nature of self. He's still in this game to help people, right? So in other words, the bodhisattva sees the emptiness of the five skandhas. He's free from clinging and attachment, but he still sees all that myriad suffering of beings and all those different permutations of suffering of beings that are made up of those five skandhas, and he has compassion for them. So he carries out his vow to liberate all these beings. This is the origin of the vow, right? This is the basis of that. So he couldn't do that work without the five skandhas. The body is the ground of our practice. So without the five skandhas, that make up this form, the bodhisattva can't do his work. So he doesn't give them up completely. He doesn't completely disappear from this world, cross over to the other shore. He makes use of those five skandhas and the teachings about them as expedient means. He stays in this samsaric world. He arouses this compassion and carries out his vow to save beings and liberate beings. So because he has the form of these five skandhas, he can actually see beings and see their suffering and appreciate and understand their suffering and all the myriad forms of unease that go with being in this body made up of these skandhas, having this body in mind. So the gate statement says, clearly understanding the expedient means of the five skandhas means the bodhisattva is prepared to see or be sensitive to all these different kinds of suffering. So these two things are not separate, right? In order to see suffering, we have to use our eyes. One has to use his eyes in order to see all this kind of suffering. And of course, that's dependent on the form of the five skandhas. So Hojo-san has talked several times about the Buddha eye, the various forms of the Buddha eye, 5 kinds of Buddha eyes. But quick review here. We have the physical eye, right, which is the one we commonly see with in this human form. We have the heavenly eye, which is the broader perspective that comes with sitting zazen, right, dropping body and mind. We have the wisdom eye, which is about seeing emptiness, seeing all the emptiness. We have the dharma eye, which is seeing that form and emptiness are both real, right? We can't let go of one or the other, but we don't cling to either one. So this is the eye of the bodhisattva, this dharma eye. And then we have the Buddha eye. So the I and Buddha and the universe that is seen are not separate. So there's no good way to put words around this kind of all-pervading vision or all-pervading sight. So it's hard to describe, but this is the way the Buddha sees, right? So the Bodhisattva is using the Dharma eye to see the five skandhas are empty, but also to see that those five skandhas are real, right? I mean, here's a body, right? So we can't ignore the body, but the Bodhisattva uses the Dharma eye to see and work with both emptiness and five skandhas. So that's how he can use his karmic conditions to carry out his vow and to help all beings. And he just, doesn't get stuck somewhere. So in a way, the Bodhisattva himself is an expedient means. We have the stories about the Buddha's life and his awakening and how he wandered around teaching until he was 80 years old, entered into parinirvana, sort of left this world. He's no longer in the world now, concretely working to liberate beings. So that now falls to the Bodhisattva, who doesn't use the Buddha eye, doesn't give up the five skandhas, doesn't cross over into somewhere else and disappear from the world. The saving of beings now falls to the Bodhisattva, right? So in a way, the Bodhisattva himself or herself is an expedient means of moving beings toward awakening. So in the opening hand of thought, Uchiyama Roshi quotes the Shodoka, which is a Chinese poem, which is important in our tradition, which says, "The five skandhas are just floating clouds that aimlessly come and go, while the three poisons are but bubbles that appear and vanish. When reality is seen, neither subject nor object exists, and in a moment the avicii karma is eradicated." So avicii is the lowest of the hell realms. I've said here before, somehow Buddhism, we are the experts in hell realms. There's like myriad hell realms. There's hot hells and cold hells, and there's a lot of hells. So the avicii realm is the lowest possible hell realm. It is not where you want to be. It's supposed to be a cube somehow, which is between 240,000 or 300,000 kilometers on a side. It's somehow buried underground. I don't know. This does not sound like a good place. Suffering there is constant. There are no periods of reprieve. There's no periods of, respite. It's just constant suffering. So this is where you go when you die having committed the worst possible infractions, the worst possible misdeeds. Something like killing a parent, killing an arhat, shedding the blood of a Buddha, slandering the Lotus Sutra, causing schism in the Sangha. Don't break up your Sangha. You'll end up in avicii hell. So we can see kind of all of the three treasures here. Shedding the blood of Buddha was Buddha, slandering the Lotus Sutra. There's some Dharma, creating schism in the Sangha. There's the Sangha. So if you are injuring the three treasures, you end up in the avicii hell. So I'm thinking there's some relationship here to the precept about not slandering the three treasures, but I haven't investigated that, right? Anyway, avicii hell is not a place you want to go. You will be there for 3.4 quintillion years working off your bad karma. So yeah, don't want to be there. But the other side of that is that means that being in the avicii hell is not permanent. If you can work your way out of it after 3.4 quintillion years, it means you're not there forever. It is possible to sort of redeem yourself from the avicii hell. Eventually, you can be released. So, to return to the Shodoka where we were, when reality is seen, neither subject nor object exists, and in a moment the avicii karma is eradicated, right? So when we completely understand the five skandhas, we are released from the evil karma that's going to land us in the avicii hell, right? We're released from that kind of suffering when we really see clearly and understand the expedient means of the five skandhas. So Uchiyama Roshi goes on to make some comments about this poem that he's quoted. He says, "Truly, all thoughts, delusions, and cravings are like bubbles and are nothing but empty comings and goings that have no substance when we wake up to Zazen. Even a hell like avicii developed by our own thoughts and fantasies becomes eradicated in an instant. Zazen enables us to experience this as reality." So I think there's some parallel between what the Bodhisattva is doing with the five skandhas and what we're doing with thoughts in Zazen, right? The Bodhisattva doesn't give up embodying the five skandhas, and we don't stop thinking in Zazen, right? Nobody's even trying to do these things. Bodhisattva is not trying to give up five skandhas. He needs that, in order to do the work. We're not trying to stop thinking in Zazen. We know that's not a goal. In this human form, thinking is going to happen. So we're not trying to stop that process. No one's aiming for that. No one's aiming for some perfect sort of immaculate state, right? We know that's not our practice. Instead, we're making use of our karmic conditions. We have to have thoughts in order to let go of thoughts. Bodhisattva needs the 5 skandhas in order to carry out the work of the Bodhisattva. So, that's okay. These things exist, and that's okay. In both cases, there's some clear insight into what's happening, and that clear insight allows for not getting stuck. So the Bodhisattva understands the emptiness of 5 skandhas, doesn't get stuck there. We understand emptiness of thoughts. We don't have to grab them, process them, do something with them. They come and go, right? So I think there's this parallel about not grasping, about using our karmic conditions and not getting stuck somewhere. So the Bodhisattva sees the emptiness of the 5 skandhas, but doesn't reject those 5 skandhas, right? In Zazen, we see our thoughts are just our thoughts. We don't reject those thoughts. We don't push them away. We don't try to turn them off. I think it's the same kind of practice. So the Bodhisattva doesn't get hijacked by the experience of being made up of these 5 skandhas. In Zazen, we don't create karma. We don't create suffering. We don't send ourselves into Avicii hell realms, based on our thoughts. We just let them come and go, right? We know one of the important things about our Zazen is we're not taking action. We're not pulled around by our karma when we're just sort of watching those thoughts arise and watching them go. So in both cases, we all get to experience the emptiness of the 5 skandhas in a very direct way, right? We really get to see them, as this gate statement says, we get to see the emptiness of them. We get to see them as expedient means, not get stuck there, but not reject them either. So I'll give Hojo-san the last word today, and then we can talk about what you'd like to talk about. He says, when we study Mahayana Buddhism, we learn that our body is just a collection of the 5 skandhas, and that it is empty and does not really exist. Still, when we injure even a tiny part of it, like our toe, we have terrible pain. If the body is empty, where does the pain come from? No individual, independent, fixed entity is there. Still, we have pain, and the pain is so real, fresh, and immediate that we need to take care of it somehow. Each pain comes from emptiness, but each pain has its own causes and conditions. We need to figure out what is the cause of each particular pain and how to take care of it. Just seeing the emptiness or oneness of all beings does not work. Within this one unified reality, there are many different kinds of pain that people suffer. Each pain has different causes and needs a different cure. We need to study each pain one by one. So I think that's a pretty good summary, right? Somehow this body, these 5 skandhas are empty, and yet, boy, you cut your finger or you stub your toe, that body's pretty real, and that pain is coming from somewhere. So this gate statement is giving us our challenge, I think, as bodhisattvas. How do we understand the 5 skandhas as both the ground of our practice, necessary for our practice of, just living and liberating beings? How does our understanding prepare us to study, as Hojo-san says, each pain one by one? First, we have to see all the myriad kinds of pain and suffering, and then can we somehow see the roots of that and how that's arising, and how that's being perpetuated, and also how do we see those 5 skandhas as an expedient means? How do we hold that and see it and work with it as emptiness? I think in many ways this gate sort of summarizes the totality of our practice as bodhisattvas. How do we hold both of these things? How do we make use of everything and still not get stuck somewhere? What would you like to say about all of those things, being a bodhisattva and working with expedient means and not getting stuck anyplace? What's on your minds today? No one's got anything to say this morning. Maybe Nate does. Or maybe Doju does.
Doju.
Okay, Doju first, then Nate.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I've been reading Living Yogacara, and a lot of I have to read every paragraph 3 times, so because it is not light reading. So we're a lot of it is talking about this alaya vijnana, which is the storehouse consciousness, but it's also a collection of all of our experiences and like everything that's occurred to us or happened to us in our lives. And then, so when we have like sense perception from the outside, sight, sound, taste, touch, meets our thinking, and then this all transforms through the manas into the alaya vijnana. So, and this manas is this I creating function. It's just interacts with our thinking. So I think of all of this, and it's still, I'm still not seeing how the five skandhas are empty. That's not really clicking with me. So I don't know if you could say something about that, like how in that process the emptiness occurs.
Yeah. Well, when we consider that none of those skandhas is permanent by itself, I mean, as we said earlier today, all of those skandhas are changing. On the basis of that alone, they have to be empty. There's no permanent fixed alaya consciousness. It's changing all the time, right? So everything connected with it is changing all the time. It's constantly taking in new stuff. It's constantly making those transformations. We can't even grab that alaya consciousness and say this thing never changes, right? We can't grab manas that way either, because what's it clinging to? It's clinging to something that's changing all the time, right? So all of those, form, certainly the body changes all the time, right? What we're taking in with our senses changes all the time. So all of those things, simply by virtue of their impermanence, have to be empty. We've also seen, you've just described how these are connected, so they don't arise separately from anything else. They can't possibly have a separate identity because they're arising, we see very clearly how they're arising from other things. So the impermanence and the interconnectedness alone means those five skandhas have to be empty. Because what are they, what does it mean that they're empty? They're empty of any fixed and permanent self nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in their very description, we see in an intellectual way how they are empty. Now, how we experience that is not so simple, right? This is why we have to sit zazen and start dropping body and mind, because until the mud settles, until the waters clear a little bit, we're often not directly in touch with how those things are functioning. I have talked with some of my colleagues. I had a friend once who, when I was training in Japan, she was from Australia and had been, I think we'd been sitting some sesshin, and she said afterwards, I actually got quiet enough that I had I could see what Manas was doing. I thought, well, that's really interesting, right? But that's not something we're going to do when we're running the stairs and driving the car, and right? I mean, we need to sort of put down this need to write the story and start to see how these things are functioning together. I mean, there's a dynamic functioning happening there. So does that help? And I'm also going to call on Doju during when he's got the floor, to add anything he wants to add there. Nate, is there anything you want to follow up on with that right now?
No, that's good. Yeah, I think on that experiential understanding, like in my experience, like emptiness makes sense. It is making more sense to me all the time. But I just more like I'm trying to understand that function of your I don't know what you call it, like psychology.
Yeah. It's a lifelong study.
Yeah, right. So anyway, where did the emptiness in that like I didn't really understand it. But yeah, that's okay.
Okay, good. You're echoing quite a bit, but I got the gist. So when you turn off and turn on the mic, it might shift something. Doju, what would you like to say about any of that, or whatever you had on your mind too?
Yeah, I think the one thing that came to mind when I was listening to both of you was that, it might be helpful to keep in mind that Yogacara and perfection of wisdom are kind of two separate philosophies. So the idea of emptiness, comes from the perfection of wisdom tradition, and Yogacara is sort of a separate tradition that historically they almost like kind of didn't overlap. They were sort of almost completely separate for a while. Later, they were combined in various ways, but in origin, Yogacara is not going to talk a lot about emptiness. It's going to talk about things more in terms of consciousness only, and the alaya consciousness and all these things. And the perfection of wisdom tradition is not going to use those terms, but focus more on how everything is empty. So that might be the source of some of the confusion, is because they're sort of separate systems that later became combined in kind of confusing ways. But so yeah. that would be what I would add on that. The thing that I was gonna bring up, well, two things actually. So the first thing that came to mind was just and I don't think your talk really like, went in this direction, which I think is probably a good thing, but the idea of skillful means, it seems like, are often kind of problematic, I think. Like there's this early sutra about skillful means that justifies killing someone on the basis of skillful means. Like it's this story where this guy is on a ship, and how does it, so like some gods like come to him in his dreams and say, this person's planning on killing everyone and stealing all their stuff. And he says, oh, well, as a bodhisattva, I have to do something about this. So like, I have to kill this other guy to prevent this bad stuff from happening. He's like, even if I go to hell, like I have to do this because otherwise bad things will happen. And so he kills this guy who, he heard in his dream was going to kill other people. And then, at the end of the story, he like doesn't go to hell because it was a skillful means and he like did the right thing. So yeah, it seems like sometimes this can get skewed around to justify ends in a way that isn't very good. So I don't know, that was just kind of one thing that I thought I'd bring up. But the other thing that's probably more interesting is this idea of secret skillful means or hidden skillful means. Brought to mind one of my favorite passages from Shobogenzo Zuimonki, where Dogen talks about doing good deeds in secret. So I pulled it up here. So he says, while no one is watching, we should do good things in secret. After we have done something unwholesome, we should expose our misdeeds and repent. When you act in this manner, good deeds done in secret will have rewards, and exposed wrong deeds will be repented so that punishment can be dispelled. Therefore, there will naturally be benefit in this present lifetime, and you will also be sure of the results in future lifetimes. I mean, the main point there being that, we always want to hide our bad deeds and display our good deeds, when we do something good for our friends, we're always quick to point it out. Did you see how I cleaned the house today? Doesn't it look great? But when we do something bad, we always try to kind of cover it up. So Dogen says we should do the opposite.
Very good. Thank you for all of that. Thank you for the clarification about Yogacara and Prajnaparamita sutras. Yeah, really important. This tradition is so huge and varied, and it's been around for so long. We can kind of get confused about how the pieces are connected. So that's an important clarification. I'm glad you were here today to do that. Yeah, the whole secret Santa thing. It's really interesting how I actually think that when these gate statements get translated into English, and somehow the English words vary from the kanji, if I had time, it would be interesting to talk about, here's what the kanji say. Now, if we riff on the English, here's a whole other dimension to this. There's a whole other way we can think about this. And I think doing the good deeds in secret is a wonderful additional element to this, which, it's not in the kanji, but I think it's really interesting. Because, yeah, of course, we want to write a lot of stories about self, about I did these wonderful things. It goes all the way back to, I created all of these temples. What merit is there? None at all, right? We want to create a story about all the good deeds that we do, right? So keeping our expedient means hidden in that way is a whole other useful conversation. What would others like to say today? Boy, there's lots to chat about. Please, Mahesh.
Yeah. So there are these various teachings, right, about five skandhas and the different dharmas, and different eyes, and different of these things. But in practical world, when I act, right, like I'm still bound by, let's say, whatever the afflictions I have, like whatever greed, anger, ignorance, and um, so let's say if and these prevent me from sticking to precepts or acting good, doing good things. So let's say it can be at work where maybe you're not able to give your 100% out of, let's say, laziness. It could be in relationships where you're not able to act out in the most kindest and compassionate manner. It could be with anyone, and these could be due to the emotions, right? Like due to the anger, greed, anger, ignorance, and these different kinds of things that arise. So how can we use these teachings in a practical way, like in our life, to keep doing good things?
Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it? It's like, what's in it for me? What does this mean for me on a moment by moment basis? So I don't think this gate is saying before we take any action, we need to take a moment to try to feel how the five skandhas are doing their thing and writing stories about self. So in a way, we have to, I think we almost have to let go of looking for an outcome. And on the other hand, I think what this gate reminds us about is, I think the important thing about this gate is a reminder not to get stuck. I think there's two things. So I think we can get stuck on an idea about what practice is. Somehow we should have some immaculate practice. We should have some, we should be in some permanent like state of perfection, and that we're not doing real practice, or that practice isn't complete or something, until we get there. So on the one hand, we've got five skandhas. We've got form, feeling, perception, formation, and consciousness. We've got these things in this human form. We can't escape from that. We have to make use of it. It would be easy to become discouraged and say, well, I have to somehow escape my suffering, or I have to escape my afflictive emotions or something in order to do this bodhisattva work. In order to do good deeds, somehow I have to leave behind this human form. Well, we can't, right? This is the ground of it. So how do we make the best use of this collection of five skandhas, knowing that we're caught up in delusion, that greed, anger, and ignorance are going to arise, that suffering, we're going to experience some kind of suffering in this human form. So like, how do we turn that? And there's no easy answer for this. This is our moment by moment practice, right? How do I make use of this human condition, my karmic conditions, in order to move beings toward awakening, and at the same time not get stuck? So I have to use everything I can here, but I also can't cling to it. And it's a really interesting place to be in, right? That's a real, that's a dance, that's a real experience of not having an inch of ground to stand on. We've got to use this, including perhaps the afflictive emotions. Maybe the afflictive emotions are a gateway to understanding somebody else's suffering, or a gateway to some understanding about the self. Those things are going to arise. We're not going to escape from them. We can't help them. We're going to have this body. This body is going to get old. It's going to get sick. We're going to have pain. We're going to die at some point. How do we transform all of that into bodhisattva activity? How does that help us arouse bodhicitta and take the vow and, have the aspiration, and still recognize through vow and repentance, we're never going to finish that work. We're going to make mistakes in that work. Our practice is never going to be complete, right? So somehow understanding five skandhas and understanding the emptiness of five skandhas lets us make use of our karmic conditions, not cling to our karmic conditions, and still do some good in the world, right? So in a nutshell, I think it's how do we hold the intersection of the five skandhas and the emptiness of the five skandhas that lets us do the work. Do you want to follow up on anything there, or does anyone else have something to say? I think, in other words, it's not all just theoretical. It would be easy to say, well, everything I told you today, it's like, yeah, that's a nice story, but like, when I go out the door, what do I do with that? It's why it's important to do zazen, because if we're out in the world doing the work, or maybe it's not quite so easy to see what's happening here. When we do the zazen, we drop off body and mind, the dust settles a little bit. Maybe we're in a little bit closer touch with how this is all functioning. That's important.
Okay. Yeah.
Mark, please.
Yeah. Because without zazen, without the practice, it looks like it is more of an act of will for me to handle these things, despite the knowledge of these things. Right?
Right, right. So we need the zazen in order to have that direct insight and have that direct experience of what's really happening with these five skandhas. We need the time to just sit and be in the middle of it and completely enter into it and completely experience it, right? Then that's when I think we have some, we're in some kind of touch with the emptiness of that. Yeah. Mark, and then I think Sagan wanted to talk too. Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. Yeah, this is my teacher coming out, which is actually kind of odd because it makes total sense here. The way I maybe, just what you and Mahesh were talking about, the first thing that comes to mind is, you see the interplay, you see the intersection as an old friend. And you go, oh, how it's good to see you. It's very simple to say something like that. It's very difficult to really understand it. You can be busy doing something, preoccupied, you have a thesis to write, you have a paper to read, or in Doju's case, another book to read, right? There's never enough books, never enough time to read all those books. And yet, a friend comes by just to chit chat that you haven't seen for a while. And it's like, oh, it's good to see you. You hold the difference between form and emptiness in front of you. It's like, oh, there you are. And so what do? Do you hold on to that idea of, I need to finish this book, I need to do this thing that I need to focus on? That actually happened to me one time. My wife lost her job when I was in grad school. She came home bawling and crying. I'm trying to comfort her, and the first thing I'm doing is saying, oh God, I got to finish these three chapters. What am I going to do? Right. And, I'm not treating that new thing as a friend. That incident as a friend. I'm not being genuine there. I'm holding on to form. I'm holding on to emptiness. And, it is a very difficult thing to do. Imagine, I've said this before, I've had cancer. So imagine being sick and holding on to that illness as a friend. Oh, it's good to see you, right? And so it's a shift in attitude, I would think. Because as my comment on your Dharma talk is, the first thing my karma comes up, and I'm thinking, my karma, my background comes up, and I'm thinking, well, you're focusing just on consciousness. You're just focusing on, on the Yogacara aspect, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't read it, but I've got it. And that starts a whole panoply of things in my head. But then I'm realizing form is emptiness and emptiness and forms, and what we're talking about are just words. And this is just nothing but, this is a Dharma talk to reinforce our zazen, reinforce our attitude. And I'm thinking, oh, okay. So there's a form to there, there's an emptiness to there, there's the interplay between that. There's a reality here as well, beyond just the idea and talking of the words. So I have my karma that I hold on, that form I'm seeing, but then also at the same time, I'm letting go of that and going, hey, yeah, this is actually a very good Dharma talk. So yeah, this is very, very interesting. This is very interesting.
Well, I think you've given a great example about how it's, if we're stuck on one side or the other, we're not able to see all the entirety of suffering, right? This gate statement is about when we don't get stuck, we see the entirety of suffering. So if we're stuck, I have a paper to write, I have 3 chapters to read, we're unable to see and interact with and work with the entirety of suffering because we have a narrow view. So if we can see that broader picture, now we put ourselves in the position of Avalokiteshvara, who's released from all suffering and distress, right? We get to see that broader thing. So here we are again about not being stuck. I think a lot of this gate is about not being stuck, as you say, on one side or the other. Sagan, did you have something you wanted to say? I thought I saw your hand up.
Well, I was curious. I heard you say in passing that we chant a chapter in the morning or something? Part of a chapter? I didn't quite get that.
Yeah, in the standard long form Sotoshu morning service, which we don't do at Sanshin,
Oh,
the one
okay.
that takes an hour or 45 minutes every morning, Fumon Bongei, is one of the 2 chapters of the Lotus Sutra that we chant like every day. So, I mean, that says to me that's a pretty important teaching.
What was it? What was the name of the chapter?
Fumon Bongei, it's chapter 25, the Universal Gateway chapter. Yeah, it's all about Kanon takes whatever form Kanon needs to take, right? Which is really simply a description of our skillful means in the world, right? What we're doing as bodhisattvas in the world. Of course, you know, in the Lotus Sutra, because there are lots of very illustrative and compelling images and stories, you know, the bodhisattvas becoming all kinds of things. But, you know, of course, the teaching for us is we fit ourselves into whatever that moment requires us to do, and then that's what we do. And we can only do that, according to this gate, if we're not stuck on the form of 5 skandhas or the emptiness of 5 skandhas. We can't adapt ourselves because we can't see everything unless we're truly not stuck.
Thank you.
Other things people would like to say?
I just,
Jeff, please.
it's kind of an observation that's it threw me off. I also thought it was another really good Dharma talk, and it was helpful for me in the review that you sort of opened with, and that organizational information was really helpful. But where I got confused was this kind of punitive moralizing that it's crept in. I didn't know where it came from. And I mean, I'd heard about all these various hells in the past, but they always seemed remote. And today they just sort of came in as this cloud of mixed metaphors hanging over things. And I was surprised and not sure what had happened. All of a sudden, this overarching balance of good and evil, and you better behave right, and so forth.
Yeah. Well, when these things pop up in texts, as it did in this poem, then I feel compelled to explain how, you know, what that cultural reference is. If I simply brush past Avicii Karma, you're going to go, what's she talking about? Right? So I have to take a little bit of a detour to say, here's in the realm of the cultures, and, you know, the Indian, Chinese, Japanese cultures, you know, there's a lot of hells. I think in the modern West, we look at those things and tie those teachings to the teachings about the wheel of samsara and the 6 realms and how we're reborn moment by moment, as opposed to, you know, there's a literal reincarnation into another realm. I think, you know, in the West, we look at that and say moment by moment, based on our thinking and what we're doing and all of that, we're sort of moving around that wheel. I think, you know, and there's a hell realm on that wheel. So I think we can say, when we find ourselves in the worst kind of suffering, we can in some way say, you know, we put ourselves into the EVGL. So I wouldn't get too like hung up on that. But it feels irresponsible not to explain what does that mean in the context of the larger Buddhist tradition. So, you know, I'm not saying that we are literally going to end up in in the lowest kind of, you know, cube under the ground. But I'm pretty sure if I didn't explain that, somebody would be asking it now. So I took that little detour. So the point of that was not to be, you know, shaking a finger and saying, don't screw up or you end up in the cube under the ground. But, you know, it feels like in the West, we are not born into a Buddhist culture, most of us. There are things we need to sort of provide the context for. And then how each individual practices with that, I leave to you. Hoshin, did I see your hand up?
Yes, you did.
And then Iris.
I just kind of wanted to respond to what Mark was talking about. It occurred to me that back in my early days of after I discovered meditation and Buddhism, and I was just reading everything. And one of the things I got my hands on was Ram Dass's Be Here Now, I think is what it was. And he said something that was kind of curious that I'd never considered before then. He said to become a connoisseur of your neuroses, which kind of speaks to this idea about gauging and embracing our skandhas, whatever they are, because that is the point that we can become clear, I guess, using our skandhas to wake up with, because it's all we have, really. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can we use 5 skandhas to transcend 5 skandhas without rejecting them, you know, or without clinging to them? And that's not easy.
Yeah.
Not easy. I think Iris had a hand up too.
Yeah, I think I wanted to go, everything people are saying very interesting. I wanted to go back to that question of bringing everything to practical life and what you keep saying about getting stuck. I think that's, you know, that's just so familiar. And what I find so interesting is it's like, it is, you know, everyday moment by moment what's happening. You know, the dog is like literally just walking in and, you know, I'm trying to talk and there's the dog trying to get my attention. But the fluidity, there's just fluidity to everything. I feel like we want to get settled into, you know, I am a good person, or settled into, you know, like the ease of like, I am not a bad person. And a lot of times, and we forget to keep going up and up and up, or like out and out and out, excuse me, into like, you know, what does the success in my life, what is that even, what am I chasing after there? Like, what is success? You know, what is, you know, like all these huge parts of our lives, and looking at like, what is the larger impact of things? And have I gotten stuck on the larger things being inherently good or bad? And so, you know, like, I hope this is making any sense, but if I'm just concentrating on what's in front of me and like, you know, emptiness and form, and just take everything else in my life as fixed and good or bad, then that's just, I don't know, that's something just to bring up. So.
Yep. Well, it's part of that larger conversation about, you know, we can get stuck in really subtle ways. You know, we can have a pretty clear picture of this part of our lives and are really kind of clinging to that part of our lives. And so I that's helpful to say, you know, we keep going out and out and out and out, which doesn't mean we stop looking at this. But how do we broaden the perspective? I mean, I think that's something that happens in Zazen. One of the things we do is broaden the perspective a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Other things people would like to say this morning? Sagan, please, and then Doju.
Yeah, and sort of as a kind of a follow-up to what Hoshin was saying about the connoisseur of our neuroses or whatever, it kind of reminds me of the statement by one of the Zen masters who said that, you know, the vast sky is not disturbed by the clouds floating through it. In a sense, there's so many different forms of clouds, our skandha, combinations of our skandhas or whatever. Some, you know, can be just wispy little clouds. Others can be huge cumulus clouds. I mean, in a sense, but in a sense, you know, none of that really disturbs the big sky, the emptiness, you know, the whole network of interdependence.
Yep, absolutely. Doju, did you want to jump back in?
Sure, yeah. So I just have sort of a nerdy linguistic point. So I'm going to put the gate statement kanji into the chat. The first, so you mentioned, you know, that this first character was translated as hidden, I guess, right? And was
in the English,
that yeah. But it also means skanda. And actually, yeah, so the original meaning of this character is like hidden or cloudy. And it's actually yin, like in yin and yang, and in Japanese. In Japanese, it's also pronounced kage, like kagemusha, if you've ever seen that Kurosawa movie. It means shadow warrior.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think here that the intended meaning is actually hidden. but it's interesting too that, you know, this is an example of like concept matching with Taoism, because, you know, this is an important Taoist term. So when Buddhism was brought to China, they, you know, took a bunch of Taoist terms and used them to describe Buddhist stuff in the same way that we use Christian terms to talk about Buddhism. Yeah, so I think it's interesting that they chose that character for skanda. So I guess it's, you know, sort of something that's hidden, you know, under our apparent sort of unity of form. They're actually, you know, these 5 things operating. Other than that, though, it's pretty literal, I think. So the first character there is, you know, hidden or skanda, and then the next 2 is skillful means, and then R, dharma, illumination, gate, no, many sufferings, therefore. So
Very good. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. Someday I want to see where your translation comes from, because I think we're not looking at the same source, and I'd be interested in yours, because I think yours might be helpful. Very good. Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. So maybe I missed the mark a little bit. Although whatever we talk about here is helpful, right?
It's probably an intentional double meaning, you know, they do that a lot. So
yeah, exactly. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really interesting. Other things people would like to say today before we do our world peace? Everyone good for now? Okay. So Hoshin, what do you think? Shall we do the closing chant and then the announcements and then the ceremony?
I'd like to do the chant, close here, and then it'll take me a few minutes to get set up. So either you could do the announcements if you want while I'm getting things together here, and then we can do the world peace ceremony.
Okay.
Okay.
Will do. That sounds good. Thanks everyone for a good discussion today and pitching in. And please have a good week until we see you next time.